We have a series of conflicts that are breaking out across the world. They seem to be disconnected, but there's a common thread or they're all tied together in some way. Help me understand this a little bit better, because it seems like they're not connected, but your assertion is that they are connected and that maybe we're either on the cusp of World War III or we're already firmly in it.
I mean, I think we have already entered World War III. We have many conflicts that are breaking out around the world, but chief to I guess the main thing that we should be considering if we're if we're ratcheting up this to the level of World War, you know, who has a hat in the ring? Um, the United States certainly does. Russia certainly does. For us to talk about um, these as skirmishes between our established proxies is to ignore that absolute fact. I don't think that's avoidable.
Well, when we have a world war, my understanding of when we had World War I, World War II, that there were two primary, I don't know, combatants that were at odds, and they ended up drawing more and more countries into the conflict due to whatever their alliances were or the theater being expanded. Do we have that same kind of a thing, or is this a different kind of world war? Or maybe I'm misunderstanding what World War I and World War II really like. I don't want to get too mired in the historical, but like if we're going to say this is World War III, there's got to be some pattern or thread that brings it together. Or is it just because you're saying that there are combatants, they're all interconnected, many of them have
A
alliances,
great
and we're fighting on multiple theaters?
Okay, a great question. I think that absolutely gets to the heart of it. World War One and World War II and the World War that we are in now are all the same war. And if we begin to step away from these notions of these nationalistic notions of who was on whose side, who was the axis of evil, who were the Allied powers, who were the socialists and who were the communists. I mean, that actually gets more deeply to the heart of it. But what these wars have been over are um, uh, the right of colonial expansion throughout the world. And you know, World War I, Germany versus Britain. It had everything to do with a conflict over who had the right to expand into Africa. World War II was a was the unfinished business of that war. And then we've had a long Cold War, and coming out of that war, the dominant powers in the world have been the United States and Russia. But as we scratch our heads and look at the lack of the political exertion or the exertion of the political will of the American people, as we talk about the deep state and are frustrated with the inability of our government to respond to the wishes of the American people, then we should start thinking about our relationships and our history with especially the likes of our former colonial overlord, England. And I won't even say Great Britain, because that is to mask the colonial dominance that England had exerted upon its own neighbors. But we should especially begin
And
to
so this is the country that the U.S. is finding itself the most at odds with these days. I mean, we certainly have seen some of the rhetoric coming out between England and the United States has been heated.
I mean, if the if the if the identity of America is one uh, of equal opportunity, a nation of immigrants, a place where you can climb up the ladder, then yes, England, and I would say even Germany, places that still have the that still have the residue of medieval class nobility structures I mean, we talk about democracy. Does England have a king? Sure does. So, and I would also point back. I mean, and again, I don't want to go too deeply into this in the history, but coming out of World War II, the the target that the United States had painted on the countries that had fought in that war was on England first and foremost, and on France second. And the reason is because the United States political class understood that those wars had been that World War One and World War Two had been about European colonial power, or European uh, uh, states fighting over who got to colonize the rest of the world. And Great Britain and France won World War One. They defeated Germany, and that meant that they were colonizing, especially Asia and Africa. And the United States had fought its way free of that, and the United States was concerned about falling under the influence of England again. Now, we should also think about how those nations have always operated in their colonial prowess. Um, you know, Spain, when they would colonize, Spain and Portugal both would intermarry between the countries. You have the likes of Belgium, who would just send the army in and dispense of any notion of an actual government. Um, France France used the franc, maybe better than anyone else. They used the monetary system to control their nation states. Look into Africa, and you will see that the Sahel states that are kicking out the French military are still using the franc. That France doesn't even use itself anymore, as it's on the euro, but it still controls that franc. How did Great Britain always operate? They set up puppet governments. So as we talk about regime change in Iran, regime change in Syria, in Afghanistan, and we point the finger at Israel, which was also a regime change that was set up by Great Britain coming out of World War II, in an area that they had targeted as going to be the most important area in the world to supply oil for their shipping empire. Um, they under they understood what the United States was up to, what Russia was up to, and understood that they were going to have to step away from the table and stand behind the Russian leader and the American leader and the other leaders in the world and whisper in their ears. And so that's what's going on today. Now we have layered on top of that a change in the optics of warfare. And we've mentioned this, we've talked about this a little bit with regards to Ukraine and to the conflicts in Western Asia between Israel and Palestine, Israel and, well, all of its neighbors, but especially Iran. That is less head-to-head conflict. And if we maybe think about what we know about the Revolutionary War in the United States, the progression of war is more towards guerrilla tactics. Well, now we have married guerrilla tactics with political subversiveness and very precise and minute technology, drones.
Well, that speaks to why I thought this image was kind of appropriate. So we've got Rutte from NATO. You're meeting with President Trump, and you've got this plane in the foreground. And while not a fighter jet, certainly the fighter jet fleet that the U.S. has seems to be very outdated in this day and age, given that the way warfare is being waged is with hypersonic missiles and drones. The US doesn't have hypersonic missiles, to my understanding, or that we haven't been pursuing that technology in the same way that others have. And drones is not necessarily the first and foremost way that the US wants to fight a war. We still have aircraft carriers in the Middle East theater. What's your take on that? Is the US trying to change up its military tactics? Well, or are we still sticking with what we've had in the past?
No, we are definitely changing up our military tactics. Now, we don't know a lot about this with open source intelligence. Um, OSINT. Um, I mean, I'm looking at the Boeing 747. I assume this is the Air Force One that there's a model of here in the foreground, and it makes me think, uh, what are the companies that are maybe the most subsidized nationwide companies that exist in the world? Boeing in the United States, also some of our
Northrop Grumman, maybe.
Yes, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon. Well, who is it? In Britain? British Aerospace Engineering, BAE. Um, um, and where did Boeing, where did Northrop Grumman, where did these companies get their start? They got their start making munitions for war, and in times of nominal peace, they are converted over for things like creating big buses in the sky to cart people around the world. But at their heart, one, they are subsidized because it's very important for nations to have the capability or once was to have these these massive and powerful tools in case of conflict, sophisticated tools. But now we can only hope that the United States has more cards held to their chest with regards to hypersonic missiles and to drone technology than we've seen so far. But at the very least, the other context of this picture that we're looking at here is this is Donald Trump on the right, Mark Rutte on the left. Rutte is in the Oval Office. They're in the Oval Office, but he came to the United States from Europe as a representative of NATO, and this is because NATO has, Trump was recently in Europe for a NATO summit. One of the leaders of NATO said, "Daddy, please don't abandon us." And Trump has brought him here to say, "We're not abandoning you, and we're going to." We asked you to contribute more of your gross domestic product towards NATO, towards your quote unquote defense, especially against your great enemy Russia. And here we are to reestablish that. But what was this conversation was mainly about the sale of weapons to NATO. And I can tell you that if I were part of the United States defense industry and I was looking at the Chinese technology that shot down the six French aircraft, Pakistan's six French aircraft in India, Pakistan, Kashmiri dust up, or I looked at the 20 Reaper drones that have been, and these are not these new order of small, inexpensive drones that are made by Iran and Russia and China today, but the 20 drones that the United States lost in the conflict with Yemen, the number of fighter jets that the United States lost in that conflict, I would be saying, hey, we've got to pivot immediately. If we're going to pivot, we have billions of dollars sunk into the development and the manufacture of some of this equipment. Maybe we should find a dupe to sell it off to. And I think that's exactly what that meeting was about. Because the United States continues, Trump, despite all of the it drives me crazy that he lies rather than meticulously states the truth and positions himself. But I also have to think, in the other hand, that he is fighting entrenched interests that he does not agree with in the United States government. So if he is forced into a position where he must support NATO and he must support British interests over the American people's interests, then he can do so by by sliding them a couple of deuces, and say, possibly, this is my guess, but saying to Putin in one of their many phone calls, I'm between a rock and a hard spot here. I'm forced to help NATO. I'm trying to extricate the United States from this European flop, but they have a great amount of control here. That they even project the narrative of or mask the narrative of their control through one of their other proxies, Israel. I'm fighting a domestic issue here that centers around the United States relationship with Israel through Epstein, through AIPAC. The American people are hoodwinked. Nobody is looking at England or Britain. My hand is forced here, but what I'm going to do is slide them some of our old antiquated aircraft. We can at least launder some dollars through Europe and continue to do that, but at the same time look elsewhere. Now, and I think that's exactly what's happening. What is Russia? And we haven't. I started out, but we got sort of sidetracked with the history of the United States and especially England and France and their empires leading in and out of World War II. We haven't talked about China, because China is certainly interested in this too. We've mentioned in the past that part of the reason for the conflict in Iran has to do with China's Belt and Road Initiative and the North-South corridor between Russia. But Russia and China both realize this, and they also realize that the United States is proud of the dollar hegemony that it uses to exert its influence around the world, and they have been openly developing an alternative to that. Trump, and many U.S. presidents, going back to Obama, maybe even Bush before then, no, it was Obama, because BRICS emerges in Obama, but even previous presidents were aware that there was a growing doubt around the rest of the world as to the United States' ability to continue to hold its word and to establish a stable currency for the rest of the world to use. And even if they were to do so, why would the rest of the states of the world bow their neck to any one local country to provide that service for the world? So we have a war against the dollar versus BRICS that doesn't just play out in banks and central banks and treasuries and in political rooms. That is playing out in, I would say, especially subversive activities throughout the world to try to change regimes. And this has everything to do with the realities of how some of these countries who did not have access to the ability to go head to head against the United States, and also a turning away, because part of these sort of massive force idea of warfare led to nuclear bombs, and the proliferation of nuclear bombs around the world has said, well, we've come to a stalemate, because it's either throw over the game board or find other means. Well, many of those other countries, Russia and Iran and China especially, have found other means, and those are the hypersonic missiles and the drones. And so they are using those, and the United States and Britain are turning towards other means now, and those are their old tools of regime change. And those regime changes are not just happening in Iran and Syria. They're happening and they continue to happen in North Korea. We continue to have propaganda about the realities of the political realities of Russia and China, especially, but the United States is also pushing on the Balkan areas, and we've seen unrest in Serbia. That has everything to do with manipulation by I say Serbia, the rest of the Balkan countries, and all over Europe. Because if you think about what's been happening in Romania, even Germany, France, there are quote unquote democratic governments that have been resistant to the desires of the people, and even here in the United States. So this is where the war is being fought now. There's another aspect of this too.
Let me go back. I want to think about this for a second. So the U.S. is continuously pursuing its traditional best card of regime change. This is the operations of the CIA internationally. Am I kind of thinking about that right? That this has been the tool that the United States has used, and that's the reason why it hasn't pursued these regional modern weapons because we don't have a regional theater to fight in. If we're going to fight, we actually have to ship personnel, equipment halfway across the world into a theater to actually make use of it. And we have bases throughout the US. I think Trump said that he's planning on closing a lot of those bases in Europe additionally. So what part of it, am I thinking about that right?
So yes, but it's not just the CIA. You got to think about the special operations forces of the United States and who the especially the special operations, and we say special, that's a euphemism for secret, and probably when we say secret, that's because it's against the will of the American people. And this is part of why our wars no longer answer to Congress but answer to the president, because those people who are standing behind the chairs of our elected politicians and whispering in their ears can exert undue influence on especially one person. This is also why the British desire for regime change and for governments around the world are not democratic institutions. You know, the reason that the United States in the 50s was upsetting various countries around the world and complaining about socialism is because those were democratic countries. And we didn't want to have to be paying off and twisting the arms of a new elected official every 4 or 6 or maybe even 2 years. And so we wanted things that looked like kings, principalities, and had some sort of prime minister, but had someone who was long in that position who we could control, or England could control. Because I say the regime change method is not the American method. And we need to think about the will of the American people and how that's been separated from the actions of government. And especially since World War II, how the notion that wars that were fought by American servicemen, by the American people, financed by American industry, have been divorced from approval by Congress and now operate in secrecy. And Congress gets bought into that by things like the defense committees, the House and the Senate defense committees, so you can isolate 10 senators and 10 representatives and have those on a committee that says, oh, everything is secret and it's much too sensitive for everyone to know about, but we're going to take care of that and look the other way. Yes, it's part CIA, but I would say it's especially like the special forces that the private army, so to speak, of the President of the United States.
And there has been some pushback in Congress from this, but not enough. There isn't enough congressional political will to defy the president, especially not President Trump.
Well, Thomas Massey seems to be making headway. I also think
that's what first came to mind. I'm not saying that there isn't some resistance, but there's not enough resistance to actually make a difference. Thomas Massey was trying to put together a coalition that would help block the big beautiful bill. That didn't end up happening. I think he's been at odds with the president at several points, but he hasn't been able to muster enough of a coalition to join him to make a difference.
Now, notice that Thomas Massey said of Donald Trump, because the question is put to him over and over and over: why does Donald Trump single you out and attack you? And Thomas Massey said, because he knows that I can handle it. And this is about a message to the rest of Congress. So again, a lot of people, paint Trump into a very one-dimensional picture. I don't want to go towards 24-dimensional chess, because I don't like the analogy of a chess game. When it comes to political conflicts, I think that very much reduces, when people project what's going on in politics, because going back to that meeting between Mark Rutte and Donald Trump, a lot of the takeaways that I saw from public discourse around it was generally sort of sycophantic praise or frustrated fury that the United.
Was it Rutte that called Donald Trump daddy? Is this
No, it wasn't. That was I believe one of the generals. Maybe it was Rutte. you should look that up. But suffice it to say that that is the obsequiousness that NATO is putting forth to the United States. The manipulation that that Europe puts towards the United States. Why? Because the United States has, or once had, greater manufacturing capacity. Now has control of the financial narrative of the rest of the world. If you're gonna buy off dupes in other countries of the world, people who bubble up to the leadership of various countries of the world. Europe needs the United States to maintain that flow of dollars.
It was Rutte. It's the same guy that called him daddy.
Well, some political pundits or defense pundits or whatever war pundits that I really like said that Rutte was chosen. Oh, the Secretary-General. Okay, yes. That said that Rutte was chosen because he's literally the dullest tool in the shed. But maybe we should give him a little more due and understand the or question the narrative of dominance and who controls who when it comes to Europe and the United States. There was somewhere I was going before we went back to there's been this narrative of excitement or disapproval coming out of the NATO United States meeting here in the Oval Office, and I see this a lot when it comes to people who are tracking political motives. I think we should all remember, when it comes to countries of the world, that countries of the world, unlike most people who live in a dense society of individuals, like, you burn somebody, you can disappear. If you get a fight with somebody on the street, odds are you're not going to see them again. Or you can design your life in such a way that you're not going to see them again. So you can ghost somebody that you disagree with. You can leave relationships. You can avoid the area that you ran into some stranger with and had a fight over who had a parking space in the street or something of the like. Countries don't get to do that. And so those people who are good leaders for countries and possibly and usually probably not elected, because this isn't terribly obvious, but this changes the nature of relationships. And so this adds a deep layer of nuance to how countries behave. And there are those who say Japan is still supporting America to the hilt. I say no. Japan is backing away slowly and taking actions that make me question their fidelity to the United States. But meanwhile, they're not going to burn that relationship. Doubtfully in the future, when we have a new alignment in especially East Asia, but even if that alignment is not to occur, they want to borrow a word from the CIA, plausible deniability as to what their true intentions were. But we are seeing many countries of the world back away from the United States and Europe. And those countries are doing so because they recognize both the methods of regime change that go back to England, and the financial the abuse of a shared monetary system that we inherited from the French, and are trying to extricate themselves from the dominance of foreign interests in what we call empire or colonialism. So that is happening.
Are we seeing that play out mostly through Japanese policy, and that they're ceasing or ramping down the amount of U.S. treasuries that they're buying, and in the way that they're helping to monetize the U.S. debt? Is that one of the primary ways that we see Japan pulling back from the United States?
I think that's a very yes, that is one of the aspects of it, but I also see it in a thawing of relations and a trotting out ideas of asking for forgiveness from the Chinese people, a a narrative about the shared history and the shared problems of colonialism. Seeing whispers of that in everywhere from North Korea to South Korea to China, to Vietnam, to Thailand. So this is something that countries and let's not forget some of the pivoting that's also going on in Western Asia, and how the likes of Saudi Arabia are beginning to distance themselves from the United States, finding a new whipping boy, that's not Iran or not Iraq, but Qatar, the one of the smallest of the countries there, and where due to their small size and lack of regional dominance has been a focal point of American and British control in the region. So we're beginning to see Qatar painted as a supporter of terrorism, and that terrorism tracking back to the subversive control that the United States British colonial empire has been exerting in the region, and we're going to see that. We're going to see that in Asia and Africa, especially both, well, as well as South America. But South America has largely, well, Brazil might be that or not Brazil, Argentina might be that interesting country when it comes to South America.
So the thread of pulling everything together is that we are currently in the midst of World War III. All these conflicts are tied together, and Israel being one of the, did you say that they're a proxy state for England? And what do you make of the recent bombing that they did on Syria? They have a ceasefire with Iran, and now they're starting another conflict. Why is Israel continuing to pursue new conflict with its neighbors, or was this always planned that they were going to strike like this?
Israel, when I think of Israel, I think a little bit of Venice back in the Fourth Crusade, and how Venice had no desire to go fight. And maybe this is well, it's one of my favorite episodes in history. Venice had no desire to go take over Jerusalem, but the German and French kings wanted to show their support for the Roman Catholic Church. So this is why the Crusades. They were always going down to headed down to the Holy Land to retake it. Uh, they needed ships from Venice, so Venice said, "Sure, come along." But they cared little for that. So they had their own designs, and went drew those armies to fight the cities up and down the Dalmatian coast of what we call the Balkan area today. Israel's doing the same thing. There are doubtless there are astute politicians and people in power there who say this is not in Israel's interest, but we are being controlled by much larger powers that we depend on, the United States and England. Maybe they even understand the degree of control that German and English leaders have on the United States, and they say, well, our hand is being forced in this way, and maybe we can have our maybe we can slide in some of our objectives too. Now, why has especially let's go back to England's relationship in the region. That region was divided up in an agreement coming out of World War II, an agreement between England and France, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and they intentionally divided that area up to create ongoing chaos in the region, to create sectarian violence in the region. England lost control of its prize. Its prize was Iran. It wanted the oil of Iran. lost control there, and in the wake of that, did whatever it could to maintain control. It first turned to the United States and said, "Will you help us? Will you help us overthrow the regime?" England's regime change tactics. Will you help us overthrow? And this is the second time. The first time I think it happened was in possibly in actually I think it was in Syria. The United States had a small regime change operation in Syria in something like 1953. Followed that up at the bequest of England in Iran. But coming out of that, England said to the United States, "Thanks for doing that. We'll take over now." And the United States said, "Oh, no, we got it." Because we were new in that business, and did not have England's long practice and experience in doing so, and probably because England stabbed us in the back after we stabbed them in the back, that led to the revolution in Iran, and since then, England has had a long interest in trying to maintain control in that region. We need to think about, again, going back to the realignment of world trade that's coming with the rise of the BRICS movement. Part of that is a new crossroads emerging from the north-south corridor through the Black Sea, through Russia, through the Arctic, which the Arctic seas are opening up, and that's part of this. That's part of this great fight. That's part of why Trump included in the first remarks that he made when he came into office, some of these bombastic statements about Greenland and Canada, because in reality, these governments are striving for this new commercial realignment that is occurring in the world. So part of that's the north-south corridor. The other part is the east-west former Silk Road, that the former Silk Road of to China. And this is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative to establish that east-west corridor that runs through Pakistan and then through Iran and possibly a little bit further on, but for access to both Europe and Africa. Now, if we think about the north-south corridor and the Silk Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, notice that those are not about shipping, because the world operated in antiquity for some time through overland trade routes. Those overland trade routes were superseded by the start of this colonial expansionism, and that was through the Portuguese, then the Spanish, and then the English. So some of these countries, Russia and China especially, that had generations, thousands of years maybe, of dominance through their trade routes, are saying we've got to resecure these, and we need to be very aware that those countries that rely on shipping and have turned world trade through shipping are deliberately manipulating the overland trade routes of antiquity in order to maintain their dominance. Now, to that, as we're closing up on the hour, I would say we also need to keep an eye on Turkey, or the former Ottoman Empire, because England, I said there is a regime change operation. England is currently whispering in the ear of Erdogan and the Turks, and saying there should be Turkish Turkish agreements between the former Mongolian peoples, and if you follow that old trade route, and you go through, if you go east from Turkey to Azerbaijan and into Turkmenistan and the other quote unquote stands, Kyrgyzstan, et cetera, on Kazakhstan, on the southern side of Russia, the northern side of China, those are all formerly Turkish people. Even Japanese is they speak a Turkish language. That was the that was the end of the ancient Silk Road, which was dominated by the Mongols in the wake of Genghis Khan or Temujin. Temujin was his name. Genghis Khan was his title. So that is also a tool that that the English and I throw Germany in this too, because we also have to remember that the House of Windsor is named after a castle, but that's a German family, the Saxe-Coburgs, you know, we say Germany, but Germany used to be a larger autonomous region with Hungary and the running Habsburg Empire. So there's a lot of identity and a shared idea about how to run the world that runs through some of these political changes in countries and family names. Um, but uh, but that's part of the realignment that we're faced with today. Again, to take it back to the start of the conversation, what is the thread that runs through World War I, World War II, and now World War III is this ancient fight over what the trade routes and the trade relationships of the world are going to be.
Fascinating. I always appreciate the historical perspective that you bring to what is happening here, to tying things back to the Silk Road, to things that I don't think a lot of us are thinking about particularly. So if you're looking for your dose of how does history intersect with what is happening in the modern world, I don't think you're ever going to find a better place to get a dose of that than on FOMO. So again, Lucas, I appreciate the historical perspective. Fascinating to hear how these historical conflicts are coming into play in the modern world. And I lament the fact that we are now in the midst of World War III, and we'll keep an eye on things as they're developing and continue to bring this perspective on FOMO as much as we can. And we'll see you next time on FOMO.